Hey, DawgNation, it's Brandon Adams, the host of DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Really excited about today's show, maybe primarily more than anything else because our phones are apparently working again. We're going to be able to take our guest, like always, of course, on a Tuesday. That means Jeff Sentell. That's going to be a lot of fun. You are going to love some of the stuff coming from out of Alabama about still some disharmony about the level of recruiting success that Georgia has enjoyed, maybe at the expense of Alabama. It's going to be a fun show. It all starts right now as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Before we get off and running with everything we have for you here today on DawgNation Daily, let me take another quick moment to remind you that as I speak right now live, it is just after 10 a.m. Eastern Time. When we do the show tomorrow at this time on Facebook Live, we have a huge DawgNation announcement that we're looking forward to making for you. Now, if you listen to us on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, you'll hear it there at your normal time to hear the program. Podcast, whenever you listen to it, you'll also hear it as well. But if you want to be with us live for the real thing when it happens tomorrow, 10 a.m. At this very time on Wednesday, we're going to make what I think is the biggest announcement in the history of DawgNation Daily, and what I think is going to be a really cool thing to tell all of you about. I'll do that 24 hours from right now, and I am really excited to be able to deliver this news. We're still, as I said, kind of crossing those T's, dotting those I's, getting those final, things in place here to really be able to unveil this on the world. But by tomorrow at 10 a.m., it's all going to be ready for you. It's going to be ready for public consumption, and we are looking forward to delivering all of that to you. Really excited about that. Something else we're excited about here on DawgNation Daily is the fact that Georgia is number one in recruiting for the class of 2018. That's good news for Georgia, and to a certain extent in the zero-sum game that is college football recruiting, it's bad news for Georgia's SEC rivals. Adding to that list of SEC rivals is probably now the Alabama Crimson Tide. Alabama has not been a natural Georgia rivalry. They haven't really played all that much over the course of their history, but given the fact they just met for the national championship, they'll be the odds-on favorites to play each other in December in the SEC championship. The Alabama-Georgia thing is sort of turning into a little bit more of a rivalry here, and you can't help but notice if you're in Alabama, the recruiting success that Georgia's enjoying for 2018 looks an awful lot like what Alabama had done in 2017, 2016, and on. You could go back through the years. One of the great sports radio stations in the state of Alabama is WJOX. It's in Birmingham, and it's a station that you may have heard before. They do a lot of college football related content, and on a show this week, they had former Alabama quarterback John Parker Wilson, JPW as they call him, was on the program, and he was kind of talking about why it is that Alabama is in the top 10, but not where it's accustomed to being, not where it's normally been, number one overall when it comes to recruiting. And one of the things that John Parker Wilson points out here is, well, you know what? Alabama's just lost a lot of assistant coaches over the course of the last 12 months and really over the course of the last couple of years. Here is John Parker Wilson on WJOX from out of Birmingham trying to explain why in 2018 Alabama is just not number one in recruiting.
I think the biggest thing, too, is our good recruiters are leaving every year, and the assistant coaches are the ones that are doing the relationships and have the relationships. And when they turn over as much, to still be doing that good with the turnover of coaches we have, that's tough. You lose so many coaches.
But now that's what he says. Hey, lose a lot of coaches. Tough to do well in recruiting. Just being in the top 10 when you've lost as much as Alabama has lost, that's still a pretty good thing. And maybe that's the case. Maybe that's true here on DawgNation Daily. It's probably not really our job to decide that. We'll let the Alabama folks decide that for themselves. But what makes John Parker Wilson on WJOX this interview sort of relevant is in the midst of sort of talking about all the assistant coaches that have left Alabama, there's really one name that springs to mind more than any other. And it's not someone who left after this 2017 season, but it's the guy who left after the 2015 season. Kirby Smart, who had helped Nick Saban build the Alabama dynasty. He left Tuscaloosa, and since then it certainly seems like he's been going to work on building his own dynasty, maybe one day at the University of Georgia. And Smart having all the recruiting success he's had in Athens, well, apparently that may still bother some of the folks in Tuscaloosa, John Parker Wilson included. Here's a little more of him, this time lamenting Kirby Smart in Athens on WJOX.
I think the biggest thing that hurts the most for Alabama guys is that one of our own, Kirby Smart, has the number one recruiting. So kind of the guy that we groomed and have helped out is now coming in our backyard or, in the Southeastern Conference and getting the number one recruiting class. I think that's the thing that hurts the most.
I don't say this to be spiteful. This is not, taking a shot at Alabama or anything like that. This is just the name of the game when it comes to college football. If Georgia is doing things that bother Alabama alumni, former players, boosters, fans, if Georgia's doing things that bother Alabama, then Georgia's doing something right. This is just sort of the nature of recruiting, the nature of competition when it comes to the rugged SEC. You want to be throwing elbows. You want to be playing a full contact, brand of football, both in terms of what you do on the field and in terms of what you do off the field for recruiting. You want to be generating headlines in a way that the competition has a hard time keeping up with. If you're doing those things, if people on, radio shows in other states are saying, can you believe what Georgia's doing with a guy that we used to have here on our campus? Well, at that point in time, you're just doing some things right. And you can't help but think about how what John Parker Wilson says about Alabama also kind of ties into what happened with Dan Mullen last week. We got Eddie the Blind Squirrel up here on the set with us here on DawgNation Daily, and a lot of that kind of goes back to what Dan Mullen said when he spoke to some Florida fans and boosters after National Signing Day. He's taking questions from the audience, and the very first question that comes his way is from a Florida booster who says, hey, Coach Mullen, what are we going to do about Georgia? And that's when Mullen goes on his rant about one SEC championship doesn't change things and blind squirrels finding nuts and everything like that. But much like John Parker Wilson, the former Alabama quarterback, is on an Alabama radio station saying, boy, it hurts to see Kirby Smart having the success he's having at Georgia when given the fact that he used to work here. The Florida guys are talking about Dan Mullen, about the Georgia recruiting class before they get to any questions about the Florida recruiting class. You could also kind of put Tennessee in this group, and y'all know right now how much Tennessee hates Georgia, kind of coming off the victory with Quay Walker on Wednesday and the hat that got thrown and all the internet memes that have been created from that. Going back to December when the number one player out of Knoxville, the Tennessee legacy, Cade Mays, also chose Georgia. That's the kind of thing that have had Tennessee fans beside themselves in anger as well. But once again, if you're doing that, you're doing something well. If you've got all your rivals, talking about the things they don't like about the way that you are recruiting. And listen, there is no doubt that what Kirby's doing at Georgia hurts Alabama. As I said before, this is a zero-sum game. There aren't enough elite 4- and 5-star players to go around. When you get more than your fair share, you're taking them from someone. You're likely taking them from your rival. Now, of course, Georgia's still got to beat Alabama on the field. Maybe that happens this December in the SEC Championship. Maybe there could be a rematch once again, the college football playoff. Who knows? But there's no doubt that Georgia's got to win these games on the field against the Alabama Crimson Tide. But our perspective here on DawgNation Daily is the more that Georgia's beating Alabama in recruiting, the more likely it is that the Dogs beat the Crimson Tide on the field as well. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are so happy to have you with us, whether you're watching us on video at 10 a.m. on the DawgNation Facebook page, checking us out on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, or in podcast form wherever podcasts are found, iTunes, SoundCloud, the world-famous DawgNation.com. We're just really, really glad that you have found DawgNation Daily here today, no matter how you're accessing the program. And I want to tell you one more time that tomorrow at 10 a.m., I am really excited about a chance to unveil a huge DawgNation announcement tomorrow. This is going to be something that I think that we're all going to be really proud of, or have a great time with. I just think this is the sort of perfect thing for DawgNation to be doing, and I can't wait to tell you all about it tomorrow at 10 a.m. for a very special DawgNation Daily announcement. I'm not trying to, build the anticipation here. We don't have all the details quite ironed out yet, but we're going to have them taken care of by tomorrow. That's our deadline to be able to deliver this to you. So tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we will do just that. And I think you'll agree with me once the announcement's made that it is a really sizable announcement here and something that we are really proud to be able to do on DawgNation Daily. I also mentioned a moment ago Eddie the Blind Squirrel being with us here today on DawgNation Daily. This is one of those things that we're obviously just doing this to have some fun with Florida coach Dan Mullen and what Mullen had to say here about, Georgia winning the SEC and its blind squirrels. And as many of you pointed out in our comment section on Facebook Live yesterday, obviously the reason why the squirrel's name is Eddie is because Dan Mullen looks just like Cousin Eddie, or at least I think he does. Many of you do as well, based on what's out there on the internet. Looks like Cousin Eddie from the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation movie. So our buddy Eddie's going to sit with me next to me here on DawgNation Daily as we kind of have some fun at Dan Mullen's expense here for what he said about Georgia, as this Georgia-Florida rivalry just gets even better and even more fun. By the way, we'll do the Gatorade countdown as we do every day here on DawgNation Daily a little bit later on in the show. But before we get to any of that, by the way, phones are working today. Jeff Sentell going to be with us in a couple minutes. That's going to be a lot of fun. Before we do any of that, that, I want to hear from Georgia coach Kirby Smart on a subject that we just sort of touched on a minute ago in the sort of the beginning of our program there. The idea that, right now Georgia's number one in recruiting, but Alabama was number one on the field. They're the reigning national champions. They get the bragging rights on that. Georgia fans excited about their future, though, given the fact that the number one recruiting class can typically mean good things. However, to hear Kirby Smart talk when he was asked about the number one ranking last Wednesday on National Signing Day, to hear him talk, he's going to clarify that while that's all fun for fans, it's not as important to him as what Alabama has, that trophy they were able to hold up in Atlanta back at the beginning of January. Here is Georgia coach Kirby Smart.
Well, I think it's great. I think it's great for the fan base, but I'd trade that number one ranking for the last number one ranking in the college football poll. So that's what's important, is what you do on the field, and that's what we'll be measured by as coaches, what we're able to do with this class, what they're able to do in development. That's the key ingredient, is what can you do with these guys nutritionally, strength and conditioning, academically, and even mentally. Mental conditioning is a big part for us. So I'm a lot more concerned with that than how many stars they got by their name.
So that's what a coach is supposed to say, and we actually even touched on this some last week, that this is the kind of thing that coaches just sort of bring up. They want to downplay what seems to be important to fans. They certainly want to downplay what the media tries to hype up. Number one classes are the kinds of things that people that do what I do for a living on shows like this, we are going to hype that kind of stuff up. Kirby says it doesn't matter. Obviously, no one would dispute that winning the games in the field is the most important, the name of the game type thing, and yet one of the things that you see is for the teams that do win a national championship, you can always draw a line back to the recruiting success that led to that. Now, it's not Kirby's job to admit that in public. It's his job to sort of, be about the serious nuts and bolts stuff, the things we have fun with. It's okay for him to ignore, but we obviously would acknowledge that there's a certain extent to hogwash that somehow not being, being number one in recruiting is not all that important. The only teams that win national championships, the only teams that truly compete for national championships are the ones that, can have a chance to put together those number one recruiting classes. And to that point, I thought that something that Chris Johnson wrote at Sports Illustrated kind of, sort of heads us in that direction in terms of a conversation. He was talking about the winners and losers from National Signing Day. As you might imagine, he included Georgia among his very highest of the list of the winners from National Signing Day. And what he writes is, in part of his write-up, a couple sentences here, Georgia may have fallen just short of winning a national football championship this season, but it's stocking its roster with the talent needed to make a college football playoff appearances a regular occurrence going forward. That's Chris Johnson from Sports Illustrated. And while Kirby Smart's saying what a coach is supposed to say, I actually agree more with what Chris Johnson writes than what Kirby Smart says, and the truth is, all of you feel the same way too. It is a hugely significant thing to be number one in recruiting. But it's not just about winning a national championship. Obviously, that's what Georgia was this close to doing in 2017, what it hopes to be able to do in 2018, and if not then, maybe by 2019 or 2020. That's obviously one of the things that this fan base craves. Haven't had that since 1980. It's the kind of thing that the rivals of UGA hold over Georgia fans' head every single day, reminding them how long it's been, especially given the fact that so many of Georgia's neighboring rivals seem to have found a way to win a national championship since Georgia was last able to do that. That's a real significant piece of unfinished business for the Georgia program. I will not deny that. But the other thing that Chris Johnson writes here that I think is actually more significant and actually more important for Georgia is the idea of not just winning a national championship, but making college football playoff appearances a regular occurrence. And, that for me is what the last couple of years for Georgia recruiting success has been all about. When you build the number one class in 2018, when you're number 3 in 2017, when you're in the top 10 in 2016, despite the fact that Kirby had never been a head coach before and was only working part-time as the Georgia coach in the build-up to National Signing Day, what you're doing is sort of stocking the kind of roster that doesn't just rise up and win one once and sort of enjoys this dream season that can never be matched again, but you build the kind of consistency that sort of has a chance to last for a real long time and see Georgia in the kind of conversations in the postseason for many years to come, the way that it enjoyed in 2017. And ultimately, that's the goal for the program. You really can't control what happens once you get to national championship games. You're going to win some, you're going to lose some. That's going to kind of work out the way that it is. But you can control how often you're in the mix for those, and that's what Georgia's recruiting success gives it a chance to do. And with that in mind, one more thing I want to mention before Jeff Sentell joins us here on DawgNation Daily is that recruiting philosophy that sort of, consistently emerges over and over again from Kirby Smart about how he's trying to build these kinds of rosters that can make, as Chris Johnson said, playoff appearances a regular occurrence. And one of the things that you're seeing is, by the look of the 2018 class, by the look of the 2017 class is really big guys are something that Georgia seems to want a lot of right now. Guys more than 300 pounds, there seem to be a lot of those in the last couple of recruiting classes. Kirby was asked about that on Wednesday, thought he gave an interesting answer.
I wouldn't say it's a priority to get them over 300 pounds. It's a priority to get really good football players. Isaiah Wynn was not a guy that was over 300 pounds when he came out, and he proved to be an excellent football player. It's more about the guys we're going after. We don't target them based on weight. We do target them based on some height and some specific descriptions for each position we have. I think Sam Pittman has proved again that he does a tremendous job recruiting the offensive line, and same thing with our defensive line. We're able to get some guys we think are really big, and in our league, the best teams you play are the teams that got size and stature and able to win the line of scrimmage. We've made no bones about it that you got to win the line of scrimmage in this conference, and that's an area we've tried to target.
I think it's really interesting that Kirby says, hey, to us, height is more important than weight. You look at a guy like Isaiah Wynn, who may have been a little undersized compared to the elite 5-star guys. I think what Kirby's suggesting there is, hey, you can take a thinner guy and make him bigger, make him stronger. But you can't take a shorter guy and make him taller. That's not the way that things work. However tall you are when you come to the college campus, about how tall you're going to say. But there's no denying that dominance along the line of scrimmage is the blueprint for how Georgia wants to be back in these playoff conversations in years ahead, and it certainly seemed to work well for the Dogs in 2017. It's good to have you with us here today on DawgNation Daily, and hope you enjoy Jeff Sentell right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And as I said a moment ago, it's good to have you with us on DawgNation Daily, and it's just good to be able to have the phones up and running and working again after a little bit of an issue with that yesterday. Jeff, first of all, good morning to you after what was a busy week for you last week with National Signing Day and the immediate aftermath thereof. Good to have you back on the program. Hope you're doing well today.
Brandon, I'm great, man. True or false? Was your birthday wish over the candles to get the phones back up and running in the DawgNation Daily Studios?
Yeah, I don't want to go for too many wishes because I feel like the National Signing Day Hall for Georgia was a pretty good granting of one of those wishes. But if I were to have blown out some birthday candles last night, that would have been certainly one of my biggest wishes of, can we please have the phones working in time for Jeff Sentell to join us on DawgNation Daily? Because, Jeff, as you know, there is still a lot of ground to cover here from the 2018 class before we sort of officially turn the page to 2019, right?
Brandon, I've got one mission, one mission for the 2019 cycle, is I'm going to find a recruit that's going to get you to look at him the way you looked at Tyson Campbell. That is my mission. There's going to be a recruit out there, and you're going to eventually say to me, Jeff, I hope this program lands this guy as much as I wanted them to land Tyson Campbell.
Well, we'll probably talk about some of those before we're done today. There is no doubt about that. But I did want to at least clean up a couple of sort of unfinished pieces of business when it comes to the class of 2018. And you're already sort of starting to pay attention to kind of who's already on campus and who's not going to be there until this summer. And, the question I start to think about is, for those early enrollees, are they going to have a chance to contribute as freshmen more quickly than some of the guys that get there this summer? For instance, if you want to look at the side-by-side comparison between the 5-star offensive lineman Cade Mays and the 5-star offensive lineman Jamari Salyer. Now, Salyer is among the most desired prospects in the entire country for 2018, but does the early start for Mays give him an advantage there in terms of maybe pushing Kendall Baker at left guard, or any other sort of scenario you want to kind of open up as a possibility? Does the extra practices this spring help him that much?
I think Mays is probably going to be more likely maybe a right guard depth guy, but he's really going to challenge Isaiah Wilson for that right tackle. I think that will be a nice battle. Either way, that one will scrape out. I think the 2-8 for Georgia at right tackle is going to look pretty sporty with some combination, I believe, that will come out of that competition. I kind of think it'll be Wilson and then Mays. You got to remember, Jamari Salyer will be coming in June, but he's already gotten the workout plan. He's going to work hard. I mean, he's working with Kevin Johnson at Pace Academy. Mind you guys out there, that's the same guy that kind of went into Rocky Balboa mode with Andrew Thomas and Nick. I think Andrew Thomas stopped short of punching sides of beef and meat lockers in terms of getting himself ready, but he did boxing, he did yoga, he dropped some weight, he got strong. I think Salyer is going to be in a prime position, in mind, body, and spirit, to come in right away. And he's going to come in with the attitude that he's going to do everything he can to take somebody's job. That might be the left guard, that might be the right guard. also a possibility that Warren Erickson can do great things during the spring. And Warren Erickson, if we want to blow the trumpet a little bit more for future Bulldogs that maybe aren't getting the love that maybe they should across the fan base, I mean, Erickson is a guy, you guys will get to know him very well when we start rolling out our preview articles in the coming months on the next generation of Bulldogs. But you saw a little glimmer of his personality if you got a chance to see Bulldogs game day over the weekend. Warren Erickson can drop just about on command and do a full split, and that is some rare agility for a 315-pound offensive lineman.
It's funny what you say about Warren Erickson. It's amazing how many people who cover Georgia have sort of arrived at the same point that, this year is not really a very good year to say, hey, watch out for this sleeper. This is the guy that's not getting enough attention that could really burst on the scene, for Georgia sometime in the future. There just aren't a lot of sleepers in this class, are there, Jeff, given the fact that, virtually everyone was a very highly rated recruit. The sort of old staple of recruiting coverage of the class sleepers, you mentioned Erickson, maybe he is one, but, there's not a long list of sleepers in this class because, when you are a, pretty highly rated 4-star or 5-star prospect, no one's sleeping on you.
Yeah, I like that comparison, Brandon. We won't call them sleepers. Well, let's call them first snooze button push guys. Those are those are about the ones we need to think about here, and especially when Georgia signs that many guys. They had 15 guys that ranked in the top 150 in this class, 18 within the top 200. And I want to kind of dial in everybody's thinking because I do think Georgia has arrived at this point, especially with this class. There's going to be a point now where the freshman phenom that comes in and gets on the field and everybody starts thinking, oh, wow, Georgia really got a lightning rod here in this young Colt. Well, that narrative should probably change in everyone's mind where Georgia's going to have such a quality person above these freshmen on the depth chart. So when they do crack through, it might be a combination of talented young upstart, but it also might mean that the guys in front of him weren't as good and weren't developing as well as everyone thought they would. It's kind of going to be more. My prediction here is it's going to be a lot harder for even these really talented guys. Like maybe the definition for someone breaking through and playing well for Georgia in their freshman year is no longer starting 8 games or 10 games like Andrew Thomas did this past season. It might be taking someone's job in the middle of the season. That, to me, is what Georgia's building in terms of depth right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And maybe the place where you see that kind of coming into fruition in 2018 more than any other is, I'm going to combine these two things together for a moment, linebackers and pass rushers. Because when you look at a lot of these 2018 signees, that may be the spot that's the most amazing for Georgia. Think about a Channing Tindall, think about a Quay Walker, think about an Adam Anderson. These are all, not to mention Brenton Cox, these are all among the very best players in the entire country. Georgia sort of has them all kind of in that same group. Now we think that Tindall may be an inside linebacker and, on and on you can go in terms of sort of figuring out the position fits for these guys. But, do you see some sort of like one name from that group that I just mentioned more obvious than the others who, may be able to do what Walter Grant did last year, which is play some? And like I think about the Notre Dame game, for instance, when I thought that Grant had a couple really interesting moments. Who from that group of like freshman linebackers, pass rushers, do you think sort of leaps to the forefront, jumps to the front of the list in terms of, hey, we may see that guy on the field, certainly by the middle of the season anyway?
Yeah, the name for me, because he's going to be expedited by an early enrollment, is going to be Brenton Cox. Yeah. I'm going to say that name a lot because he's already 255 pounds. He's in the weight program. He's hungry. He's one of those guys that is kind of mindful that he's expecting a 3-year college career. And he's the type of guy that's going to be talented enough to come in and maybe elevate his play above guys like Robert Beal, and even right there along with Walter Grant to kind of get on the field fast because he does embody what that Alabama linebacker has always looked like. But Cox is going to be able to play the run very well. I'll always remember a story when he was visiting after the Auburn loss, and Georgia got right in his ear, and they said, listen, maybe one of the reasons why we didn't play so well against the Auburn Tigers in Jordan-Hare Stadium was because we didn't have guys like you. When we mean guys like you, we mean 250-pounders that can hold up against the ground assault and the run, but then also has that sort of B-button and wiggle to kind of play in the surf and play in space and make plays happen out on the edge in the pass rush front. So Brenton's going to be the guy that I might hang my hat on because But there's a lot there, Brandon. You ever think about an healthy Azeez Ojulari? I saw what he could do at the opening when he was full bore. You think about Channing Tindall. You think about Adam Anderson. And then you think about Quay Walker. I'm going to roll off. Those names I just rolled off there, Brandon, they would crack starting lineups at most of the SEC East next fall. They might just be grinding and trying to find a glimmer, finding a crack of playing time daylight in Athens for a little bit.
So I think that you brought up a really good point a moment ago, that something you're going to see less of at Georgia in the future is a guy like Andrew Thomas sort of stepping in, saving Georgia's offensive line, becoming a really solid starter as a true freshman. Hopefully the Georgia roster is deep enough going forward that those kinds of like freshman phenoms are just a little harder to come by, because it's harder to crack those starting jobs. Along those lines, though, if you see less of that, something you may see more of is a guy from, like, say, 2 recruiting cycles ago, all of a sudden he blossoms in any given year. Think about, for Georgia, the number 3 class in the country in 2017. A lot of freshmen contributed last year, but there are now some second year in the program guys who we may see this be the year where they sort of, step forward and really do something great. You mentioned Isaiah Wilson a moment ago. He might be one of those guys. I think you got to include Richard LeCount maybe in that conversation. We've talked about J.J. Holloman a little bit this week here on DawgNation Daily as maybe being one of those guys also. I mean, do you see a name or two from the 2017 class who maybe didn't have it be his year last season, but in his second year in the program, either as a redshirt freshman or as a sophomore, has a chance to all of a sudden blossom into something pretty good here?
Yeah, I like a lot of those names. I'm going to reserve this for maybe guys, because I kind of look at a guy like Malik Herring. He played a whole lot last year, especially in the playoffs. He's a guy that might even play some at defensive tackle. He's growing to be so big. But obviously he's recruited to play the defensive end spot. You mentioned Richard LeCount in the third. Naturally, I kind of think he's going to tandem with J.R. Reed to form the new starting safety look at Georgia in the fall of 2018. A name or two that I want to see kind of peek through the clouds a little bit that would be great for the future of Georgia football. I got a couple. I think a lot of people bring up J.J. Holloman's name a lot because he's very talented and his ceiling is quite vast, but folks tend to forget a little bit about Trey Blunt. Trey Blunt actually played in 15 or 14 of the 15 games last year, got some special teams work, started at one game because Georgia went run heavy, I think, in one of their bigger packages. And Trey Blunt's a guy to think about because he's got two things. Number one, he's going to work hard. That's a given. But the second thing is he's very physical. But a lot of people forget he might be one of the 3 or 4 fastest receivers on the Georgia team. That's a guy to think about there. I know everybody's wanting me to also recite the name Matt Landers. That's a guy that I think will be given the keys, I guess, at first reps of spring ball to kind of slide into that Javon Wims, big back shoulder, big body, red zone weapon guy. Another name I want to see what he can do in his second year. I want to see what maybe a Trey Bishop can do and also a Robert Thiel can do, because those guys have been in the program for a little bit now. They've had the chance to compete. They know what it takes. They saw what it takes. And for Georgia to continue having a lot of home runs in that 2017 class, those are some guys that didn't play a whole lot, especially the last 2 names they redshirted. But I still think some big things could happen for those guys in 2018.
Let me bring you kind of in on a conversation we've had before here on the program. Obviously, the thought would be that DeAndre Swift gets the most carries of any running back for Georgia next season. That may be true even if Zamir White is back fully healthy again. You've kind of told us before in the program that you think that Zamir White has a chance to be a sensational player, sensational prospect. Certainly, maybe we see that in his freshman season. But that's probably going to be more like second half of the year than first half of the year, given the fact that he's still recovering from injury. So the thing we've said here on our program is that means for that South Carolina game, certainly the 2 cupcakes surrounding South Carolina, that's a real opportunity for a guy like Elijah Holyfield and a guy like Brian Herrien to really assert themselves as the back that ought to be getting the sort of second most carries behind DeAndre Swift. A real chance for Holyfield and Herrien to earn some legit playing time there. Along those lines, though, how do you think James Cook factors in that conversation? Is Cook a guy that is going to have to wait his turn here a little bit at Georgia, or is he good enough to kind of make it hard on Herrien and Holyfield to be the number 2 back behind DeAndre Swift while Zamir White's recovering from injury?
Yeah, Cook is a guy. I'm just going to, the best way that I can compare those 3 right there is just remember what their body types look like exiting their senior seasons of high school. And I think Cook's a guy that might even look like a bigger look for what Georgia got with Isaiah McKenzie and even Nicole Hardman in the slot. He's kind of going to be a slash type back. I mean, I wouldn't call him like a Warwick Dunn type, but maybe a bigger Warwick Dunn type. I'm talking about, I guess the obvious parallel would be to say he could be another Sony Michel in the Georgia offense, and that might be the perfect descriptor there for James Cook, because he's about 5'11 and a half. He ran some slot receiver and some running back at the U.S. Army All-American practices. He's a guy that's thickened up a lot. He's running track during his high school season at Miami Northwestern. And Cook's a guy, I hope people remember, he was classified in the 2019 class, the Nolan Smith and Jaden Hazelwood class, but he cranked his academics up into overdrive and started taking extra classes in order to reclassify himself into the 2018 class. And he's all caught up now in the 2018 class and expected to arrive sometime around June, really chomping at the bit to join the program as well. But Cook is a guy that's going to come in very muscled up, and I think, and I don't know why people kind of think of this as a detractor for James Cook a little bit, because maybe he's not the pure three-down running back, but he's got a lot of skills, Brandon. Good catch, goes after the ball really well, runs good routes, good acceleration, lots of wiggle. And I think you'd have to know a lot about your Georgia football recruiting to also recall the fact that James Cook, if he wanted to be a defensive back, he's athletic enough to probably be the second or third best defensive back in this class, because he was known for a lot of pick sixes and a lot of big ball games for Miami Central across his prep career.
But let me follow up on one thing, though, on James Cook, because you make the Sony Michel comparison. We've kind of heard that before. I think we've even kind of kicked that around here on DawgNation Daily. The one thing about Michel, though, was if you go back and look at him in 2015 when Nick Chubb was injured, Michel got 1,300 yards rushing that season. So you talk about the true three-down back. Michel showed you that he could be that when he didn't have Nick Chubb to help him out. He had that physical component to run between the tackles. Do you think that James Cook has that element to his game? And it's sort of okay if he doesn't, because there's still a lot of ways to contribute, as a slot guy, as a sort of Isaiah McKenzie type for Georgia. But Michel proved that he was more than that. Do you think that James Cook has a chance to be truly like Sony Michel in that he can also be a between-the-tackles runner?
Yeah, I think so, Brandon. And I'm not going to try to be too humorous here by saying this, but if Sony Michel can get 1,300 yards behind that Georgia line he ran behind years ago, I think James Cook could get 1,600, 1,700 yards behind the Georgia line that he will eventually run behind, because the boys up front are going to be a whole lot different for anybody to kind of run behind the plow a little bit in 2018, 2019, and 2020 for Georgia. I mean, Cook is a guy, the subsection of this conversation really fascinates me a little bit, Brandon, but I don't know, as talented as I think that DeAndre Swift is, I don't know if he'll ever be that 25 carry a game guy for Georgia. Mm-hmm. I think his zone might be 15 to 20 carries, where early on you might see Harrion and Holyfield, especially Holyfield, grabbing that bulk of those shots inside between the tackles, those power plays, those ISO plays, and everything else like that. Holyfield and Harrion can be very effective hammers in many of the same ways that Nick Chubb has been for Georgia as well.
All right, a couple quick things here. Let me turn my attention to 2019 for a moment. You obviously had a sort of an attention-grabbing headline the other day about how the 2019 class can actually even be better for Georgia than the 2018 class. I don't want to give the whole thing away here because I want people to read the Sentell Intel piece for themselves here, but a couple bullet points on why you think the future's even brighter for Georgia potentially in 2019 than it turned out to be for 2018.
Yeah, first of all, just going to say something that you might want to make sure your red and black glasses are on really tight here and kind of get the lens cleaner out on them right there. I don't think there's any way Georgia's signing another 8 or signing another 7 5-stars in 2019. I don't think they're going to top that number. Anybody in my business that predicts record hauls back-to-back for recruiting classes, even with a guy like Kirby Smart behind the stick of the chopper or something like that, that's going to be very illogical to try and trade for very long in that sort of business. But I think Georgia's class can get a lot better for two main reasons. It's because, I think you stated earlier, that Georgia's class was significantly top-heavy. 15 players among the top 150 in the country. Then they added a couple more within the top 200 in the country. But then after that, I think when you got down to about their final 8 guys in the class, none of those guys were really highly rated. I mean, outside the top 300. That's what we're talking about now with Georgia recruiting, when someone is maybe the nation's number 315 player, and somehow they're not highly rated anymore. But nonetheless, if Georgia just attacks maybe the floor of the class, and they add a lot more top 200 players among like signee number 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, I think this year's class can even soar above what 2018 did. I did a mock-up on my own with names that I feel will eventually choose Georgia, and then names that might 50-50 choose Georgia, and then I just kind of scattered around some names that are favoring Georgia or have Georgia, rated quite highly. And Georgia broke last year's number, the 2018 number, with their 23rd commitment or signee in my way too early projected mock-up for 2019. So it's quite possible Georgia signs an even better class in 2019, especially due to the fact that there is such an abundance of 4-star prospects in the state of Georgia for 2019. Georgia can really clean up in-state and not have to burn a lot of those chopper miles. And that's how Georgia can and this is rarefied air, friend, for Georgia to jump into the top, to have a better class than they did this year, you're going to have to be talking about one of the top 2 or 3 classes that has ever been put together.
So you mentioned, at the top of our interview about, names I'm going to obsess over the next year. Obviously, we already know who some of those are. When it comes to current Georgia commits, it's a wide receiver like Jaden Hazelwood, who I talk about all the time. In terms of a non-committed player that's a big recruiting target, obviously a linebacker like Owen Popo is kind of, at the forefront of that conversation. But the other name, Jeff, that I think I'm going to probably be talking to a lot about in the sort of weeks and months ahead is a guy like Trayvon Walker, a outstanding defensive lineman from the state of Georgia. When I look at what Georgia has done with its defensive line recruiting the last couple cycles, that's one of the few spots where Georgia just has not really cleaned up with the kind of like big, bold print 4-5-star name. No disrespect to Devontae Wyatt, no disrespect to Tramel Walthour, no disrespect to Jordan Davis, but that is sort of the outlier in terms of, hey, the big 4-star guy, the 5-star guy. You're not getting as many of those in the last 2 recruiting cycles along the defensive line, which I think puts a lot of pressure on Georgia to bring in guys like Walker for the 2019 class. Now, he's not that big yet. I think he's only listed somewhere in that sort of 250, 260 range in terms of his poundage, but he's a big-time prospect. You've actually mentioned him before. You've written about him recently at DawgNation.com. I sort of feel like this may about to be one of those names that I start obsessing over just a bit.
Yeah, Trevon's the guy, because he thinks he's got 4.5, 4.6 speed, Brandon, especially once he gets some speed training down. He's an incredible double-doubles machine on the basketball court. Talking about a defensive tackle here with a 34, 35-inch vertical leap. Talking about a guy that's been on a basketball team that I don't think has lost a game in like 60 games, approaching right now for Upson Lee. Of course, that's the home of David Marshall. But, Brandon, that's a good thing to start about with your thought train and everybody for DawgNation for 2019, because Mikhail Carter was very good. Tyler Clark is probably one of the very elite tackles in the SEC already. Julian Rochester is a guy to think about, but the last time Georgia signed a top 10 defensive tackle, that was big Julian Rochester, who was number 10 overall out of McEachern High School, and that was way back in the class of 2016 for a little bit when 2 or 3 5-stars was still a pretty good year for Georgia in terms of a recruiting haul. And before that, you had to go to Big Trenton Thompson. So elite defensive tackle. Trevon Walker is kind of like a 4-star right now in a lot of those evaluating panels' eyes, but he's going to keep rising when they see what he can do. About 6'5", 6'6". Maybe right now, if you think about the in-state tug here, as well as the position need, and I think him and Owen Popo might be the first 2 really big guys that fans should really circle on as 2 of those maybe got-to-get guys for 2019.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for your time. I know we kept you long today, but we're looking forward to picking your brain about a lot of stuff. You delivered just like always. We loved you last night on the big Kroger Before the Hedges recruiting show with our buddy Hannah Chalker. Great to see you back on that program again. I know you'll get your Wednesday night Facebook Live coming up this week as well, and we'll just enjoy getting as much recruiting information as we can get from you here as this 2019 cycle starts to really pick up steam here now that 2018's over.
Hey, Brandon, hope the Addams family birthday pizza and cookie cake was all good last night, sir.
It was, Jeff. I appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, in my family, we are very much like what has become a bit of a recruiting cliche here. ESPN's written about this. I know there was a recruit, 2019 kid that chose Arkansas over Texas A&M this week, but kind of like devouring into a cookie cake. The connection that cookie cake seemed to have with high school football recruiting, it's also true at my house as well. Many of you are aware it was my birthday yesterday, and that's a bit of a tradition in our house. We have two small kids, 6-year-old and 2-year-old, so they love the cookie cake, as you might imagine, and they get as excited about the adult birthdays as they do about their own because they know that's going to mean plenty of cookie cake around the house. And yeah, we had a good bit yesterday, so a nice celebration of the birthday. And for those of you that sent me some well wishes on social media yesterday, I certainly appreciate that. It was a terrific birthday. Thanks so much for all of that. And by the way, I mentioned, if you're not watching the Kroger Before the Hedges DawgNation recruiting show that comes up every Monday night here on the DawgNation Facebook page, you got to check that out. Our buddy Hannah Chalker, who's a good friend of us here at DawgNation Daily, she's on that. Of course, our DawgNation recruiting insider, Jeff Sentell, on that as well. They always do a terrific job on that, and we always enjoy watching that. A couple SEC stories I want to hit for our SEC Through today, and of course, I also want to remind you to make sure you join us for SEC Country Live at 3 p.m. Eastern Time today on the SEC Country Facebook page. We do it every Monday through Thursday. Love having Georgia fans in the comment section with us on that program or just watching along. I occasionally hear from many of you who say, hey, I never comment, but I always like to watch, or I never, tweet or, put a comment in the comment section, but I always like to listen to the podcast or listen to the radio. Listen, we love all of you, whether you interact with comments or not. We're just glad you're out there for us on our DawgNation Daily. But as far as the SEC stories that go for today, I think it's interesting that Andy Kennedy, the Ole Miss basketball coach, has announced that he's stepping down at the end of the season. Now, there'll be an obvious line kind of drawn here between Kennedy and Ole Miss and what might happen with Georgia's coach Mark Fox. The Clarion Ledger, the big newspaper there in Jackson, Mississippi, has kind of written about this a little bit. Let me give you a couple of sentences here, and I think you'll see the tie-in with Mark Fox. It says, Kennedy's Ole Miss's all-time winningest coach led the Rebels to an SEC tournament championship, 2 NCAA tournament appearances, 5th man in SEC history to win at least 20 games 9 times in his first 11 seasons. The others are Billy Donovan, Joe B. Hall, Tubby Smith, and Nolan Richardson. Those are all pretty significant names. The writer of the piece goes on to say, but this is the 3rd straight year where Ole Miss is not near the NCAA tournament conversation. In fact, this is his worst team. The 2017-2018 Rebels are 11-14 overall, losers of 5 straight, and 7 of their last 8. So the takeaway here is that the argument of, hey, how does the resume, how does the track record look in comparison to the program's past? How does that look? Well, that's no longer an argument in the SEC to help you keep your job. That's not going to work for Andy Kennedy there at Ole Miss, despite the fact that Ole Miss is not a big-time SEC program, both in terms of revenue or really in terms of anything else. Ole Miss is sort of whatever tiers you put in the SEC. I'm going to assume that you've got Ole Miss near the bottom tier, no matter how you're measuring SEC programs. And yet, when it comes to Ole Miss, they got that brand new gym they built. Was it last year or 2 years ago that opened for the first time? They've got a coach that has won some games for them, but they're not looking to hold on to him if they're not going to the NCAA tournament. That's apparently in basketball the only thing that matters now. So when the Mark Fox resume gets kicked around, and some of y'all may have it memorized better than I do. Certainly been a string of 20-win season. There have been a lot of those. Not enough tournament wins, though. Better recruiting when you start factoring in the 2019 class. But that kind of stuff, much like it's not helping Andy Kennedy, maybe it's not going to help Mark Fox here at the end of the season as well. I don't say that with any joy, any glee. I don't, take a lot of, pleasure in watching coaches get fired. But I think that the voices of Georgia fans are saying, hey, we're not getting enough from our basketball program. Maybe that voice is going to be heard this season. It would seem that it's being heard there at Ole Miss. A couple other stories I want to get to after kind of going long on that one just a little bit. We talked about this on SEC Country Live yesterday. Tom Van Haren, a writer for ESPN.com, was talking about the connection between recruiting and college football playoff appearances. And what Van Haren said is that if you look at the teams that made the college football playoff, they mostly have averaged at least top 15 classes for each of the last 4 years prior to the year they make the college football playoff, which is good news for a few SEC schools. One of the schools that he included, and the surprise here, is Tennessee. Obviously, Georgia, Alabama, Auburn, LSU, you expect them to be mentioned. Tennessee was the surprise. So the kind of weird takeaway here is, hey, maybe Tennessee's more talented than we can give them credit for right now. Maybe they have a chance to compete in a way that other people would not have expected them to be able to. I think that narrative is mostly wrong. I explained on SEC Country Live yesterday why I think that it is. While top 15 classes may be good enough to get you in the playoff, if you're Michigan State from the Big Ten or, Oklahoma from the Big 12, you are mostly beating up on teams that have recruited inferior to you. Having a top 15 average over the last 4 years in the SEC is frankly just not that big of a deal because teams like Auburn, Alabama, Georgia, those are the teams that you would potentially have to knock off to be in the playoff, and all of them, including, by the way, LSU as well, who Tennessee played last season, have all recruited better than you have. So I think that the ESPN analysis here is kind of interesting, but ultimately in Tennessee's case, I think it's probably misleading. I quoted from Chris Johnson from SI a little earlier about signing day winners and losers. In terms of his other SEC winners, he mentions Texas A&M, he mentions Florida, he mentions Alabama. And on the A&M thing, obviously, I've credited Jimbo Fisher before. I think he's done incredibly well. I think he's going to do really well at LSU at A&M moving forward. But the Florida thing is kind of interesting here to me. Yes, Florida did close with a couple of guys. Yes, they did get Jacob Copeland. Yes, they, Andrew Chatfield from down in Plantation, American Heritage. They won with all of these guys, but it's still not a top 10 class for Florida. Something, by the way, that Will Muschamp did on the regular. It's amazing to me how, and I don't say this as the ultimate Gatorade, although that's what I am. In this particular case, that's not what I'm talking about. It's just sort of amazing to me how when it comes to Florida recruiting, it's almost like the nation is sort of grading on a curve now, comparing Dan Mullen to Jim McElwain, it was a total failure, as opposed to comparing Dan Mullen to the standard at Florida, which for right now, Mullen's still beneath. I think that the door is still open for Georgia to dominate the SEC East, not only because of what Georgia has done, but because of what schools like Florida are currently not doing. And I don't believe I could have included Florida on a list of signing day winners for me. If you're interested, by the way, the only signing day loser from the SEC that Chris Johnson mentioned was LSU. LSU, who missed on a couple high-profile prospects, I think putting certainly Ed Orgeron in the crosshairs here of needing to do well on the field in 2018. To keep any momentum for his program going into 2019 will make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, I also want to mention something else that's been kind of on the internet out there when it comes to recruiting over the last couple of days. What I think is single-handedly the worst national signing day take I have certainly read this entire year, maybe in quite some time. It literally comes from like the dustiest, oldest corner of the internet imaginable, from the ultimate sort of get off my lawn type, voice, Dennis Dodd from CBS Sports. The headline here is, National Signing Day 2018 was less chaotic and noisy thanks to the early signing period. What Dodd seems to be suggesting by the headline alone, which he probably didn't write, but nonetheless, what he seems to be suggesting here is that chaos and noise is a bad thing, for big-time blue-check brigade, old media guys who don't want to be disturbed in their slumber during the offseason, being bothered with what the sort of peasant fans care about when it comes to recruiting overall and the hysteria that is National Signing Day. One of the things that he writes in here is, you may remember the outlandishness of the past. 7 years ago, Georgia commit Isaiah Crowell pulled a Bulldog puppy out from underneath the table to announce he was joining the Bulldogs. They called it a mini UGA. It was a max disgrace for what recruiting had become, an annual sideshow of teenage excess. Well, listen, I don't know that recruiting necessarily represents teenage excess or not. What I would suggest to a Dennis Dodd and anybody from that sort of old guard media that feels the way that Dodd does, if you really want to sort of be offended by the excesses in college football, it's not the excess of the teenagers that I'd be the most offended about. It's the excess of the athletic administrations that are spending millions and millions upon millions of dollars every single year, most of them to the tune of very little success. The coaches who are making very high seven figures, in some cases over the course of long-term contracts, high eight-figure contracts, only to not live up to the to the success that you would think would be commensurate with contracts like that. That to me is the real excess when it comes to college football. And yet when it comes to voices like Dennis Dodd, they don't seem to be quite as offended by that as they do with the kids having a little bit of fun on National Signing Day. And for me, that's ultimately what National Signing Day is all about. It's about the fun. Chaos, listen, chaos is what it is when you see programs competing for the sport's most limited resource, which is the elite 4- and 5-star players that ultimately crown teams champions. You get those guys, you're going to win. You don't have them, you're not. That's why National Signing Day is a big deal, whether the sort of mainstream media wants to ignore it or not. Dennis Dodd's column for CBS Sports, for me, the worst take I read about all of signing day for the entire year. All right, as we get ready to wrap up here on DawgNation Daily today, my buddy Eddie the Blind Squirrel, and if you listen to the show, you don't see Eddie, but if you ever check us out on Facebook Live, he sits right next to me on the show in honor of Dan Mullen, who said when it comes to Georgia's SEC championship that even a blind squirrel finds a nut every now and then. Well, we think that blind squirrel may find another victory against Florida in 2018 as well when the Dogs get back to Jacksonville. That's why we do the Gator Hater Countdown every single day here on DawgNation Daily, and we will remind you that 256 days from right now, we think Georgia goes back to Jacksonville and gets another win over the Florida Gators. 42-7 again, I don't know. We'll see. I'm sure the Georgia players and coaches will feel a sense of motivation to respond to what Mullen said to the boosters and fans there on National Signing Day. He may have been kidding when he said it. I think he probably was, but I think the Georgia players will probably find a way to take that seriously. It's good to have you with us on DawgNation Daily. Big announcement tomorrow at 10 a.m. We'll see you for it then. And for those of you watching us on video, we'll take some time to get to your comments. You can kind of weigh in on anything you want to from today's show. We'll look forward to hearing from you on all of that. Just give me a second to get them pulled up. Good to have the phones working again today, by the way. As Jeff said, that may have been the best possible birthday present for me as I was able to enjoy all of that. Alan Verbanchik asked about Tennessee. He says, did Derek Dooley do better than Butch Jones? I think overall Dooley, probably did, and certainly from a recruiting standpoint, Jones was better. But part of the comparison for Derek Dooley is there have been some things written about this on the internet. Dooley, much like I guess maybe Jimbo Fisher at the end of his Florida State run, had essentially stopped recruiting there in 2012, which I think ended up being his final class there at Tennessee. So part of the problem that Tennessee has had as a program is the fact that you had, a guy like, Derek Dooley, who I'm going to assume just became overwhelmed by the recruiting process and the strains on his job there at Tennessee. I'm going to assume that's kind of what was kind of going on with that. Obviously, a big time bad loss there for the Vols. All right, let me get back in here and get some more comments up and rolling here again. Sorry about that. I lost them for a moment. Tim Tatum thinking about Bulldogs in the past. We may be having a little bit of an issue with our Facebook feed here. Either that or it's my computer that's having trouble. Diedrich Frazier says Kirby used that blind squirrel comment and was going to have the dog salivating in October. Yeah, I think that's probably true, Diedrich. I think it's one of those things where, Dan Mullen, when he said it, was kidding about it, but I don't think that's going to stop Georgia and certainly the Georgia coaches from using that to their advantage. I think that's one of the things this coaching staff really does well is use those kinds of things to its advantage. It looks like we have frozen up here, so we'll see if we can get that fixed. For those of you that are hopefully still with us, we'll see if we can get that taken care of. Some of you weighing in on that. All right, yeah. So we're gonna get this unfrozen here, and we'll see if we can get back with you in just a second. All right, I want to get some updates on this. Jamie Bailey says we're going to have to get these glitches fixed if we ever go to ESPN. Yeah, listen, it's not as easy as we make it look sometimes getting the daily show on the video here. Every now and then we have a little bit of an issue, but we'll see if we can get that fixed and taken care of. All right, let me see if I can refresh the page and see if we're all good here. It looks like that's going to work out pretty well here. That's going to be good. All right, good stuff. All right, we got some time for some more comments. I'll get mine refreshed and get a lot more of them going here, and we'll see if we can get these knocked out here. Andy Sloan says, I find it odd that fans of other teams actually take the time to troll this show. So I guess there have been some trolls in here in the program. And, listen, this is one of those things where, this is going to, this is going to happen. It's going to kind of go down here from time to time. We're going to have that kind of take place. That's just one of those things that's going to kind of go down here.
I can't tell if we're back on or not. I can't quite tell what's going on here, but we may get ready to wrap up here for today because it looks like I'm not quite seeing them. For some reason, I'm just not seeing the comments coming up. This looks like it's an issue on my computer, so I'm going to try this one more time and see if I can get ready to get this going. And if not, maybe we may have to get out of here because my computer is certainly having its issues right now. I'll tell you what, let me talk through kind of getting back into this one more time, and let's see if this works here. I completely exited out, completely get back in. Michael's rushing in to help me. Y'all say hello to Michael, by the way. Michael always does a good job here. All right, now we're back in. Justin Minton asking about Mark Fox's job being safe. I don't think in any way that Fox's job is necessarily safe. Does he have an opportunity to still earn that job back? He may very well have a chance to do that by winning some games at the end of the season. But it's certainly not a safe job here for Mark Fox right now. Not at all. Wayne Folan says we're back up and running here. That's good to know. So all that's cleared up, and we're kind of rolling through here. Ryan Benson mentioning the fact that Otis Reese played safety in high school some, and I think that's the position he's going to get a chance to play first at Georgia. I think he's going to get a chance to, he may have to be one of those guys, to go back to what Jeff Sentell was saying, that may have to earn his way onto the field here over the course of either his first season on campus or maybe the first couple seasons on campus. He may be one of the guys that sort of experiences some of the challenges of some of the extra depth that Georgia has now. But, the long-range prognosis, I think, for Otis Reese is actually pretty interesting in that in the modern game, when you're facing so many of these spread offenses where you have to play with the extra defensive back, but you don't want to sacrifice your ability to stop the run. Reese is one of those guys that gives you a really interesting dynamic there in terms of, being big enough to stop the run, but also fast enough to run with those fourth receivers, whether it be a tight end or just a fourth slot receiver. That's a pretty interesting profile as a player. Really good stuff. Santiago D. Arn says, who would we hire, I should say, if Mark Fox were to get fired? I will admit, I don't follow this stuff as closely as I used to in terms of, who are the candidates that are out there. The name that I see on the message boards a lot, is it Steve Forbes? Is that his name? A guy who I believe is at one of the Tennessee schools, like East Tennessee State or Middle Tennessee State, somewhere like that. I've seen that name pop up. I know Tom Crean kind of pops up from time to time, going back to his time at Indiana. I am not equipped right now to sort of give the full list to you, but in terms of likely candidates, but that is something I sort of plan on trying to do a little research on and seeing if I can figure out that for myself. And of course, the one thing we always kind of get back to when it comes to this kind of stuff is you gotta compete with the folks who are just not interested in basketball at all. Somebody also says, Justin Minton in the comment section says, give Jonas Hayes a shot. Certainly Jonas Hayes has proven that he's a terrific recruiter, and there's no doubt about that. Is he ready to be a head coach at a place like Georgia? Is that a risk worth taking? If Jonas Hayes was an assistant at some other school and was not a Georgia alumnus, would he be getting consideration for the Georgia job? That's the question you have to ask here. If he would be, then he's a name you want to put on your short list. But if you're only putting him on your short list because he's a Georgia alumnus, at that point in time, you could be potentially making a mistake. Obviously, he's had more recruiting wins lately than many other Georgia coaches have ever had. I certainly will grant that, even if I'm not following the basketball recruiting nearly as close as I'm following the football recruiting. There's no doubt about that. But being a head coach does require a little bit more than that. Is Jonas Hayes ready for that element of the job? The truth is, I just don't know. But obviously, he's recruited well enough that I would think he at least get some consideration. Brian Wright also brings up the name we had mentioned yesterday, which is Ron Hunter from Georgia State. I think I said this yesterday. He makes the tournament run in the year where he had his son, and that can seemingly seem somewhat easy to do, given the fact that he's your own flesh and blood. Of course, he's going to want to play for you, and he's also a first-round pick. But Georgia State's still doing pretty well this year, too. So, Hunter's showing that he can coach. Shannon Baker has an interesting comment. Do you agree that South Carolina is our watch-yourself team in the East? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make. That Carolina, when Georgia goes to Columbia the second week of the season, Georgia's still going to be a pretty big favorite, even though the game's on the road, I would think. But I think that South Carolina is the second best team in the SEC East. And I think that Muschamp would know the importance of playing well there against Georgia for what it could do for the rest of the 2018 season, and for what it could potentially do in terms of South Carolina's recruiting efforts, given the fact that it's there alongside Tennessee and still Clemson and Auburn, programs trying to come into the state of Georgia for recruiting. So South Carolina is going to be incredibly motivated to play well in that game against Georgia. It is sort of I think you said sort of a watch yourself type game. I think that's a pretty good description for it. Now, ultimately, I think that Georgia will be ready for it. I actually like the idea of playing this game back near the beginning of the season. I always thought that was one of the cool sort of mini traditions that Georgia had of starting the SEC slate with a team like South Carolina. It feels more appropriate to play that game near the beginning of the season than it does, towards the end of the season. And I think the presence early in the year is actually going to make Georgia more motivated for the game because Kirby Smart wants to send that sort of early message to his team. So there is that. Kathy Green mentioning Barrett's Lee tweet. I have not seen that, although Barrett is a friend. I will try to check that out to see what that is. Austin Moore talking about Williams-Brice Stadium being a tough place to play. It truly is a challenging place. There is no doubt about that. Melinda Moe says that Georgia's going to beat South Carolina 42-7. So no matter how improved South Carolina is, some Georgia fans say, hey, it's still going to be an easy win for the Dogs. If it's 42-7, that's worth pointing out. It'll be easier on the road this year than it was in Athens this most recent season. Michael O'Neill says the secondary is going to be better this year than it was last season. What do you think? I think it has certainly a good chance to be. I think that DeAndre Baker is going to be your lockdown cornerback on one side. I think that Tyson Campbell is going to get a chance to earn that spot on the other. I also think that secondary is one of those positions where experience really matters. I'm going to talk about that on DawgNation Daily this week, something that Bill Connolly from Football Study Hall has kind of written about that. It's a place where experience matters, but I do think Georgia has a chance to be better. All right. Sorry for the issue with the comments earlier. We were able to kind of get these up and running here now, though. Thanks for getting in on the show. Don't forget, tomorrow at 10 a.m., we've got a huge DawgNation announcement. We'll make it right off the top of the show, so if you normally watch this on video, show up tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I'll make a big, big announcement that I'm very, very proud to deliver. We'll do that with you at 10 a.m., and we will see you then. By the way, SEC Country Live, 3 p.m. Eastern Time today on the SEC Country Facebook page. We'll have the podcast up here for you on iTunes and SoundCloud very soon as well, and we will see you tomorrow for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live. Y'all have a great day.